Hey everybody, this is chapter 13 of Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels. The chapter is titled Communism as Industrial Puritanism. In chapter 4, quote, Toward a Philosophical Anthropology, end quote, an attempt was made to define the Marxian idea of communism. In this chapter, an attempt will be made to accurately characterize Engels' conception of communism. The divergence of thought between the two men was nowhere more clearly manifest than in their conflicting interpretation of the future communist society. This was entirely logical. Their vision of socialism was the culmination of their basic thought patterns. The divergence between their philosophies of man, nature, and history thus exploded into sharp polarity on the issue in which these philosophies were to achieve their fullest crystallization. It was at that point where both men tried to suggest the consequences and results of their theories that their irreconcilable differences became most apparent. Primarily, the divergent views of Marx and Engels over communism derived from a different interpretation of the anthropological nature of man. To put it more succinctly, the two men learned different things from Ludwig Feuerbach. Although critical of Feuerbach, Marx was greatly influenced by his anthropological humanism. Marx was to incorporate this anthropological center, the centrality of species being, into his view of history and into his view of communism. Engels did no such thing. The Feuerbachian notion of species being was entirely overlooked by Engels. In fact, Engels seemed unaware of the naturalism that was the base of Feuerbach's philosophy. Therefore, when Engels came to define communist society, he did so without reference to anthropological humanism, but rather from a Victorian Calvinist idolization of work and productivity. One could speculate that Engels' childhood pietism finally triumphed over his thought in later life. Written in 1886, 9 years before his death, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy contained Engels' mature and final evaluation of this pivotal German philosopher. As a young man in 1846, after his initial acquaintance with the work of Feuerbach, Engels had written several letters to Marx in which he was critical and hostile to the author of The Essence of Christianity. Essence of Christianity being a book by Ludwig Feuerbach. The Engels of 1886 held the same opinion of Feuerbach as he had 40 years earlier. The same confusion and misunderstanding towards Feuerbach were manifest by Engels throughout his life. According to Engels, the essence of Christianity revolutionized classical German philosophy. The essence of Christianity brought an end to the idealism of Fichte, Kant, and Hegel. Quote, the great basic question of all philosophy, end quote, Engels believed was the relationship between thinking and being. German idealism assumed the priority of thinking to being. Feuerbach reintroduced materialism to German philosophy. Engels defined materialism as the belief that nature took priority over thinking. Feuerbach educated a generation of German scholars to the causal predominance of nature over idea, according to Engels. Engels' definition of materialism was both unsophisticated and naive. Materialism for Engels meant that the explanations for events must always be located in external and physical objects. Materialism for Engels was synonymous with things. Furthermore, Engels could not discern the distinction between materialism and naturalism. Feuerbach was really a naturalist, but Engels never referred to Feuerbach by this nomenclature. The failure to distinguish between materialism and naturalism meant that Engels remained unaware of the serious difference between physics and anthropology. Rather than interpret human nature as a universal being of the species, Engels interpreted human nature from the perspective of a chemist or physicist. Engels began not with the emotional and psychological nature of man, but rather with physical nature. For Engels, the world did not proceed from man, but rather man proceeded out of nature, and man was reduced to molecular and atomic constituents. Furthermore, in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels credited Hegel, even though at the same time condemning Hegel for his idealism, with one of the greatest discoveries of the 19th century. It was Hegel who proclaimed that history, philosophy, man were all process and change. Feuerbach was also responsible for one of the great discoveries of the 19th century. He proclaimed the primacy of nature. But Feuerbach's materialism was defective, according to Engels. It was a static materialism. It was a materialism that lacked the notions of process and change. Engels referred to Feuerbach as a mechanistic materialist. For Engels, mechanistic materialism meant a view of nature that was static. There were other features of mechanistic materialism, but Engels preferred to limit his judgment to the notion of a fixed finite and stable universe. Engels was clearly critical of such a view and felt that any interpretation of nature that was not predicated on the notion of process was ipso facto a defective interpretation of nature. Engels joined materialism to the idea of process, but Engels defined materialism as nature in its appearance as chemistry or physics. In the same book, Engels also criticized Feuerbach for a static view of man. According to Engels, the Feuerbachian man, quote, remains always the same abstract man who occupied the field in the philosophy of religion, end quote. In other words, the attempt of Feuerbach to abstract an unchanging essence from the species was labeled by Engels as, quote, real idealism, end quote. On the other hand, Engels criticized Feuerbach because Feuerbach's abstraction of man abstracted man from society. Feuerbach dealt with man as man would always exist. He had not taken into account the social or political influences on the species or how the species had changed throughout history. On this score, Engels was on solid ground. Marx had criticized Feuerbach for much the same reasons in his theses on Feuerbach. Engels, however, had failed to make an important distinction. Engels had failed to separate the attempt to abstract a being of man from the attempt to abstract man entirely from history. Marx was able to see man both as historicity and as anthropological essence. Marx combined process with naturalistic ontology. Engels, conversely, completely overlooked the naturalistic core and fell to the other extreme of viewing human nature itself as totally historical. Essence for Engels is completely absorbed in flux. In addition, Engels accused Feuerbach of making a religion out of his theory of human needs and human sentiments. For example, Engels wrote that, quote, with Feuerbach, sex love becomes one of the highest forms, if not the highest form, of the practice of his new religion, end quote. However, far from creating a new religion, Feuerbach wished to show the source of religion in human sentiments. Feuerbach was creating not a religion of God, but a religion of man. Supernatural religion, a religion totally divorced from its origins in human anthropology, was, according to Feuerbach, the highest proof of the process of species alienation. By attacking Feuerbach so totally, Engels illustrated that he understood neither the idea of alienation nor the idea of alienation's implications. When Engels was to study anthropology, he did not, like Marx, turn to Feuerbach, but turned instead to Darwin. Engels' predisposition to positivism was again revealed by his trying to explain man solely on the basis of evolutionary biology. According to Engels, man must be processed, he must evolve. Engels denied the Feuerbachian abstraction of man and maintained that human nature itself was an evolutionary product. This evolutionary process was still continuing. It was Engels who wed socialism to Darwinism. In the piece titled "The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man," Engels acknowledged his debt to Darwin and claimed that, quote, that labor created man himself, end quote. From Engels' understanding of Darwinian theory, quote, the decisive step in the transition from ape to man, end quote, was the achievement of erect posture by Homo sapiens. Man was a descendant of the anthropoid apes, and his erect gait allowed him to use his hands with ever-increasing freedom and dexterity. With the development of the hand, with man's increased productivity, members of society could work with greater cooperation. Production increased the need for social harmony, and social harmony produced the need for speech. The brain was stimulated to grow in capacity as speech became a human trait. This sounds rather Lamarckian. I wonder if he'll say that. Like Lamarckian has the idea, it's kind of like to my understanding, it's like a functionalist kind of, like an extreme functionalist interpretation of an teleological interpretation of evolution. So, for instance, a Lamarckian would say like as the giraffe's neck grew to facilitate its eating from higher trees, right? It had like an intent. It was like an intent purpose, whereas in Darwin, just like non-teleological, right? Evolution comes about through mutations being passed on to later generations, right? And not being like weeded out, right? So that's why you have like, disease and stuff that are like genetic mutations. They just don't hamper reproduction. So if if like an advantageous trait comes to be, it's not because there was some kind, it was like destined to be so, or came into existence for functional purposes. It would just was a contingent freak mutation that had advantages, or at least did not inhibit reproduction, right? Like they're like it's not like, maybe that's a misrepresentation of Lamarckianism. Lamarckianism, I think, might be perhaps maybe more the idea of like have more of an active component, right? So I think like Lamarckianism might say something like adaptations come from things that like predecessors do. So if you're like lifting big heavy rocks or something like that and you become really strong, it's going to make your kids strong. And if the giraffe really stretches his neck out far to like try to reach, you know, a high piece of, you know, a high tree or something like that, it's going to cause the necks of his children to be longer or something like that. I think that might be more Lamarckian proper. I want you to know that I'm talking very much out my butthole right now. I don't know what I'm saying, but that seems to be like when you like, it seems to like it's just a big misunderstanding of evolution is like kind of like a functional, deterministic kind of like teleological notion of like why certain adaptations come to be, right? Like, of course, you know, there are advantages, and the advantageousness of a particular trait explains why that trait, it's possible for that trait to pass on from generation to generation, but that's not why that trait came into existence in the first place, right? And that's also true of negative traits, right? Like if you think of like someone having like a propensity for like, you know, breast cancer or like heart disease or something like that, those are not advantageous things in order to live. They just merely don't inhibit someone from reproducing, right? You know, like if you have a genetic predisposition to have breast cancer in your 40s or whatever, that doesn't mean you can't produce a lot of kids prior to that. It just doesn't, yeah. So like thinking that like this really like harmonistic functional view of evolution is kind of a misunderstanding of the process of evolution. So, anyway, where the hell am I? With the development of the hand, with man's increased productivity, members of society could work with greater cooperation. Production increased the need for social harmony, and social harmony produced the need for speech. The brain was also stimulated to grow in capacity as speech became a human trait. Speech had encouraged the growth of mental powers, and increased mental powers also encouraged the development of different senses. The freeing of the hand as an instrument for labor was the necessary first step in the evolution of the vocal, mental, and sensory constitution of man. Engels sought to reduce all evolutionary activity and economic activity to one source, labor. In doing so, he completely distorted the meaning of the term, quote, labor. When Engels referred to labor in his evolutionary picture of human nature, he really meant adaptation. In the Darwinian sense, he meant the ability of the organism to adapt, adjust to the natural environment. This definition of labor was not what political economists, including Marx, meant by labor. Labor for the political economist implied an outpouring of activity, human praxis that modified and thus added something to the world. Labor for the economist referred to the additive quality, the capacity to enhance and increase beyond an object's natural properties, which was lodged in human practice. Adaptation referred to a selective process that was carried on by the natural environment. It was the environment that either destroyed or else preserved specific properties of the organism. The difference between destruction or preservation rests on the mutual correspondence between the properties of the organism and the properties of the environment. Conversely, labor implied that the human or animal was active, adaptation implied that the environment was active, or selective, that the preservation of species properties was the function of the natural or social surroundings. When Engels confused labor with adaptability, Engels again demonstrated that imprecision of thought which blurred Engels' thinking throughout his life. Engels' inability to arrive at precise definitions of terms, to distinctly categorize concepts, led Engels to confuse one idea with another, led to gross logical errors. Engels made the mistake of confusing labor with adaptability because Engels was looking for a material reason to explain human physical development. Material reason, for Engels, meant external object, meant a, quote, thing, end quote. The hand was such a thing. The hand was active. The hand labored. Therefore, labor must be the cause of human physical evolution. Engels' cosmological determinism found its correlative in an evolutionary determinism. The physiological development of man proceeded with the same iron-bound linear necessity as the functioning of the universe. Engels again affirmed that the more scientific knowledge increased, quote, the more men will not only feel but also know their oneness with nature, and the more impossible will become the senseless and unnatural idea of a contrast between mind and matter, man and nature, soul and body, end quote. Mind and man were products of materialistic laws, the growth of brain capacity being a necessary consequence of the greater demands of a more developed larynx. The mechanistic laws of the universe were the same mechanistic laws of human biological evolution. In the hands of Engels, anthropology became synonymous with evolutionary positivism. It was impossible for Engels to develop a philosophic anthropology of man, because anthropology for Engels meant linear and mechanistic evolutionism. In the 1890s, Engels began to refer to his theories, fearing that they were also Marx's, as, quote, historical materialism. The exact meaning that Engels gave to this term is now clear. By historical materialism, Engels meant a view of nature, understood as physics and chemistry, that was based on change. On another level, Engels defined historical materialism as the belief that technical and industrial changes were the central causative factors in history, and that they inevitably changed, so must society inevitably change. Historical materialism meant economic determinism. The Marxian view of social change was at variance with the Engelsian conception on two accounts. First, when Marx spoke of nature, he meant the anthropological nature of man. Marx did not speculate about the ultimate constitution of the universe. That was Engels. When Marx meditated about nature, he pondered the naturalistic being of the species man. Materialism did not imply chemistry for Marx, but rather naturalism. Furthermore, it was a constitutive naturalism rather than a reductive materialism, as in the case of Engels. That is, Marx's naturalism presupposed that one element of the species being of man was the need of man to objectify man's self, and that this objectification of the essence of man was a constitutive and genetic cause of the social universe. Secondly, when investigating society, Marx did not, like Engels, begin with the notion of process. Rather, Marx began with the notion of structure. Marx did not presume flux. Marx presumed structures that were imbalanced, and because of this imbalance must alter their internal organization. Marxism was an analytical tool, a device to investigate the internal structure of social organisms from the point of view of conflict, from the point of view of the clash between form and content. Change was consequence of this clash, rather than a cause. Process was a result of this conflict and imbalance rather than its source. For Marx, what was given was structure. For Engels, what was given was flux. For these reasons, the theories of Engels could be referred to as, quote, historical materialism, end quote, but not the theories of Marx. The best term not only epitomize Marxism, but also distinguish Marxism from Engelsism is, quote, dialectical naturalism, end quote. Marx was dialectical because it presumed a societal structure and conflict, imbalance between form and content. Marxism was naturalistic because Marxism presumed that both the form and content of a given societal structure were in part constituted by the anthropological being of man. The lack of philosophical anthropology had clear implications for Engels' definition of communism. Engels did not, like Marx, develop a philosophy of culture. Rather, Engels developed a philosophy of production, or a philosophy of the distribution of goods. For Engels, communism was synonymous with the mathematical apportionment of labor and the mathematical apportionment of distribution. It was a social calculus for the equality of work and the equality of possession. Engels and Marx disagreed over the definition of communism because Engels' intellectual lexicon lacked such concepts as objectification, alienation, reappropriation, and self-affirmation. For Marx, men were compelled to objectify themselves. Therefore, men were active. Labor was one mode of their activity. Labor was the form of mediation between the objective natural essence of man and the objective external object made by man. The object made by man corresponded to the species being of man. For Marx, man humanized nature, because something of man's self was implanted in the dumb material that physical nature offered to him. Without a concept of species being, Engels could not arrive at a concept of objectification. Since Engels did not recognize an anthropological human essence, Engels could not see that an external object fashioned by man must correspond to the internal objective essence of man. Labor for Engels was not a form of mediation between an active human nature and an inactive external nature. Labor for Engels meant the manipulation of matter. Labor meant understanding the laws of matter in order to control matter, to make matter work for human interests. The difference between Marx and Engels was the difference between the mutual interpenetration between man and nature and the control of nature by man. Marx again talked of immanence. Engels talked of a scientifically precocious factory manager. For Marx, alienation meant the separation between the object made and the objective essence of man. That is, once the object was made, it was not returned to its maker. It was not used to confirm or to complement the anthropological core. The object made was divorced from man, was expropriated from man by an alien power. Communism for Marx meant the end of alienation, meant that the objectification of man would be returned to man and therefore corroborate man's objective power. Communist society would be the sociological affirmation of species being. Engels had no theory of alienation. Engels had no theory of alienation because Engels had no theory of species being. Therefore, Engels simply assumed that under communism, the administration of the economy, which would replace the state, would be the growth of freedom. Only the state was oppressive, economic administration would liberate. Engels was blind to the fact that the administration of products itself could lead to human alienation. Because Engels did not see that the state and also every social product was an objectification of the human essence, Engels did not see that the administration of economic life could be just as exploitative, just as alienating as capitalist society. For instance, the administration of economic life through a great extension of the working day would be just as exploitative under Engels' communism as it would be under capitalism. Engels failed to see the economic decisions must be made on the criteria of anthropological eudaimonism. The notion of reappropriation played an immensely important role in Marx's definition of communism. In communist society, man would reappropriate his own objectification. Reappropriation in this sense meant direct return or total absence of mediation. What would be returned to man would not be materiality, not merely the formal aspects of the object made, but instead the content. That is, that part of the external objectification which carried the talents, abilities, dispositions, and drives of man would be immediately present for man to experience. This experience, either mental or sensual, of the internal objective content of man and the external objectifications of man, confirmed man to himself. That is, communist society was a self-confirming society. Engels had no notion of reappropriation. When Engels talked about return, Engels meant simply materiality. What was returned to man in Engels' communist society was merely an equal quantity of labor embodied as a physical object. Human talents, abilities, dispositions, drives were not returned, but only a thing, a possession was returned. Engels equated communism with materiality. Marx equated communism with human essence. Engels' stress was really upon acquisition of things. Engels' communist man was still an acquisitive man. What he acquired was food, clothing, shelter, education, leisure. Again, communism for Engels was an additive process. The continued augmentation of productive power would mean a corresponding decrease of necessary labor time. A lessening of socially necessary labor time would mean an expansion of leisure time, and thus man would have more time to do the things he liked. The notion of self-affirmation. The notion of self-affirmation was another vital concept for Marx. The confirmation of internal objective essence by external objectifications affirmed the human self. The talents of the self, the abilities of the self, the drives of the self were positively affirmed by the appearance and power of these talents, abilities, and drives in an external object. To experience self as expression, as power, as a generative force, was to experience contentment with self. Communist society, by making reappropriation immediate, made self-affirmation immediate. Marx was concerned with the inner man, and communism for Marx was allied with eudaimonism. Engels possessed no idea of self-affirmation. Engels was not dealing with a self that found its complement in society, but instead a self that was concerned and committed to industrial productivity. Engels' concern was not with a being who was content with itself because it was self-expressive, but a being who is diligent and responsible in his work, in his labor to produce an abundance in the Faustian theme of domination over nature. The Marxian vision derived from the classical ideal of an organic, harmonious society. Behind Marx stood the Greek ideal of the polis. Behind Engels stood the Renaissance theme of the magician alchemist. Ironically, Engels' vision of communism was heavily overlaid with many bourgeois elements. Engels talked of economic abundance. Engels talked of control over nature. Engels also talked about social control and rational socioeconomic centralized planning. Engels talked of acquisitiveness. The communist society Engels described was the epitome of Weberian and middle-class entrepreneurial economic rationality. Engels manifested the bourgeois belief in unending progress based on scientific gadgetry, scientific alchemy. Engels seemed to be saying that a communist society, one without private property in the state, could do everything bourgeois society tried to do, only better. Thus, Engels' communist society perpetuated bourgeois ideals, values, and ethics. Engels' socialism would not breed a new socialist man. Rather, Engels' socialism would allow the bourgeois man to continue to exist, only within the framework of a rationalized economy. Engels' pietism triumphed at the end. Engels' vision of communism combined a superabundant scientific utopia with Calvinist morality. Engels began with the gray discipline of work. Engels ended with the Calvinist commandment to make provision on this earth and to materially prosper on this earth. Geneva rather than Athens was the image in Engels' mind. In his hands, communism assumed a puritanical stamp. So far, this chapter has focused on what communism did not mean for Engels. We must now describe with accuracy what communism did mean for Engels. We shall do so under the following categories. 1. The technological base for communism. 2. The state. 3. The end of classes. 4. Production. 5. Distribution. 6. Centralized planning and worker control. 7. Freedom and necessity. 1. The technological base for communism. Communism came into existence for Engels when the means of production stood at a high productive level. In short, communism was a function of a certain level of technological development. Conversely, communism could not have existed during the Renaissance or the feudal period, or the age of Greece or Rome. In periods of underproductivity, classes developed as a consequence of the struggle to possess a few or scanty material objects produced. However, in a period of sufficient productivity or abundant productivity, the age that dawned at the end of the 19th century, there would be no need for classes, no need for the struggle of possession, because there would be enough for everyone. Communism for Engels was not a static society. Communism was not a fixed, eternally formed, perfect society. Communism was a cardinal feature of Engels' Weltanschauung. That process and flux were primary. Communism, therefore, would undergo transformation. The victory of communism over capitalism for Engels meant the abolition of the state, the destruction of classes and the division of labor, the transcendence of the dichotomy between production as a social activity and distribution carried out in terms of private appropriation. Once the Communist Revolution had eradicated these forms of capitalist expropriation, communist society would evolve, however, always within the parameters of what had been destroyed. In short, the lack of a state, the lack of classes and a division of labor, the lack of a tension between social production and private appropriation would be the conditions, the ground of future communist evolution. 2. The state. Engels had a decidedly mechanistic view of the state. In Engels' understanding of the origin of the state, there first came property, then classes to contend the ownership of this property, and then the state as a form of oppression to keep the propertyless from asserting themselves. The state for Engels was simply power. It was simply a political tool of domination. In Engels' eyes, the state was solely a machine, operating in the interests of those who wished to preserve the monopolization of possession. Unlike Marx, Engels did not see the state as a form of alienation. Furthermore, Engels did not see the difference between state and society. For Marx, society was the activity and behavior of man that grew out of his species being. Society was the practice of man's anthropological core. The state for Marx came into existence because there was a defect in society. The defect was the division of labor, out of which classes grew, out of which the struggle for property grew, out of which the state grew. In Marx's vision, the state and society were counterposed against each other, the state representing alienated human existence. The communist revolution for Marx meant the destruction of the state, but also meant the reemergence of society, or as Marx put it, social life in fact became political. What was abolished for Engels after the communist revolution was solely political power, the domination of one person by another based on property. Political life as such, within Engels' terminology, came to an end, but social regulation continued. There would still be the, quote, administration of things, end quote. There would still be, quote, the conduct of the processes of production, end quote. In his essay On Authority, Engels strongly upheld the need for social regulation in the factory and society, that is, quote, the conduct of the processes of production, end quote, must dictate or organize many areas of social activity. What Engels did not see was that the, quote, administration of things, end quote, the conduct of the processes of production, end quote, could be just as dominating as the state. Because Engels defined oppression simply in political terms, he could not see that economic administration could be oppressive and alienating. Communism, for Engels, meant the end of political existence. Such was not the case with Marx. For Marx, communism meant the triumph of society. Thus, political life was possible for Marx under communism as long as it was expressive, or as long as it was subordinate to human social life, or species being. What Marx did not want was that the state should act, quote, as an independent entity that possesses its own intellectual, moral, and free basis, end quote. What Marx did want was that the state should be converted, quote, from an organ standing above society into one completely subordinated to society, end quote. That is, for Marx, communism meant species and anthropological life becoming political life, the unanimity and harmony of natural and political man. It was because Engels allowed administrative legislation to become a, quote, independent entity that possesses its own intellectual, moral, and free basis, end quote, that Engels inadvertently allowed administrative legislation to develop into another state. Engels' version was not inconsonant with the Saint-Simonian managerial society. Section 3. The end of classes. Under communism, not only the state, but also social classes would cease to exist. But social classes, according to Engels, were a function of property and the division of labor. Property, when introduced into a society in which the division of labor existed, caused a struggle between different branches within the division of labor for its possession. The branch that won possession of property thereby formed itself into a class. But the fundamental cause for the development of social classes was the social division of labor. In a communist society, therefore, the division of labor must be abolished. Engels proposed to do this by increasing job mobility. By means of better education, better job training, an individual could be trained to perform many jobs within his vocational lifetime. The rotation, the circulation of the laboring force would end the division of labor and end social classes. The rotation of jobs would democratize the vocational structure of communist society. The democratization of the occupational hierarchy would prevent co-administrative power from being monopolized by people in a specific set of occupational groups. Engels was again primarily concerned with questions of power and oppression. The use of the democratic rotation system in occupational placement would prevent power from accruing to a certain set of occupational groups, and the present eco-administrative expropriation. Just as Engels was opposed to the monopolization of property, so he was opposed to monopolization of economic functions. Exclusivity in terms of socioeconomic functions would lead to excessive privilege and control. Under communism, for Engels, There could be no monopoly of function because such exclusivity entailed possession and control. Engels was opposed to occupational elitism because it implied the same kind of domination as property elitism. For instance, Engels was opposed to an independent intellectual group. In other words, Engels was opposed to a group that simply specialized in evaluating and producing culture. He was against it because such an intellectual group would then have an autonomous existence. That is, its occupational function would be totally divorced from the social and productive needs of society. The culture produced would not be representative of society generally, but only representative of a small group of people. Section 4, Production. Production for Engels meant mastery. It meant the control and domination of both technology and nature that would ensure economic abundance. Under communism, man would no longer be subject to the laws of the factory or the laws of the physical universe. Rather, under communism, the laws of the factory and laws of the physical universe would be under the control of man, and thus be enormously productive. Man would be master. Production in Engels' communist society would be organized on the basis of centralized plan. Mastery involved control, and control involved rationalization, according to Engels. He also apparently believed that productivity increased when it was organized from and by one center. In Anti-During, he wrote, quote, "Only a society which makes possible the harmonious cooperation of its productive forces on the basis of one single vast plan," end quote, could properly manage the economic development of a country. Engels was aware, however, end quote, quote, "Only a society which makes possible the harmonious cooperation of its productive forces on the basis of one single vast plan," end quote, could properly manage the economic development of a country. Engels is aware, however, that a communist society would never be a society of complete equality. Even though the enormous differences between rural life and urban life would be destroyed, some disparity of living style would remain. Likewise, the end of the division of labor would bring an end to classes, but not total equality of occupational power. Socioeconomic egalitarianism was the end towards which communist society moved. It was the principle of communist society, but it was not an end easily realized. Even in a communist society, deviations from the ideal would occur, but Engels throughout his life was an adherent of the Babeufist notion that communism meant economic egalitarianism. Certainly Engels believed in labor egalitarianism. When Engels wrote that under communism, quote, "no individual can put on to other persons his share in productive labor," end quote, he obviously meant that every person must labor in equal shares. Babeuf's notion of egalitarianism was extended by Engels to productive egalitarianism. Everyone must labor in accordance with equal quotas of labor duration. Again, Engels, the materialist, was apparent. Equality for Engels came to mean like measure, like quantities. Equality of labor meant for Engels equal quantities of time duration spent in labor. Even though the mechanistic side, the quantifiable side of Engels did predominate, he was not exclusively mechanistic. In other words, he also believed that labor under communism would, quote, "become a pleasure instead of a burden," end quote. Because people would not be fixed into classes, would not become hard specialists solely performing one repetitive task, labor would become less monotonous. In fact, based upon the principle of democratization of function, where people would perform several tasks, labor would become enjoyable because their full abilities and talents would be free to be expressed. The mere absence of specialization would encourage the positive expression of the vanity of human abilities. The laborer would not be a cog, but a full expressive person. I'm sorry, I have COVID. I'm very, very congested. Section 5, Distribution. In Engels' mind, economics could be reduced to mathematics. The model that Engels kept before his eyes when he thought of a communist economic science is borrowed from mathematical chemistry and mathematical physics. Here again, Engels sought to reduce economics to a quantifiable natural science. Engels' latent sense of positivism drove his economic thinking in the direction of a productive and distributive calculus. Engels' communism was merely a society in which the function of production and distribution could be carried on with a rationalized mathematical certainty and apportionment. In his Anti-During, Engels indicated that commodity production would cease under communism. That arch commodity money would also cease to exist because it would be possible to quantify all objects made by the amount of labor placed into them. Quote, The quantity of social labor contained in a product has then no need to be established in a roundabout way. Daily experience shows in a direct way how much of it is required on the average." End quote. Engels thought it possible to quantifiably determine the exact amount of labor necessary to produce the object society needed. He also felt it possible to quantifiably calculate the amount of labor available in society. The possession of such data would make economic planning merely a matter of mathematical calculation. Planning could be conducted with the accuracy of an algebraic formula. Quote, "Society can calculate simply how many hours are contained in a steam engine, a bushel of wheat of the last harvest, or 100 square yards of cloth of a certain quality." For instance, the formula used to calculate productive egalitarianism might be expressed as labor necessary divided by labor available. For instance, the formula used to calculate productive egalitarianism might be expressed as labor necessary divided by labor available. The division of available labor into necessary labor would inform us as to the quantity of labor each person must perform in order for society to produce the objects required for its sustenance. The calculus of economics would be a certain guide as to the distribution of equal shares of labor. Similarly, the calculus of economics would be a certain guide to the egalitarianism of distribution. Again, in his Anti-Düring, Engels made the following statement, quote, "It is true that even when it was still to be necessary, quote, it is true that even then it will still be necessary for society to know how much labor each article of consumption requires for its production. It will have to arrange its plans of production in accordance with its means of production, which include, in particular, its labor forces. The useful effects of the various articles of consumption, compared with each other and with the quantity of labor required for their production, will in the last analysis determine the plan." End quote. The central production plan was an expression of the ratio of available labor to necessary labor. The distribution of goods could proceed in terms of the same ratio. By knowing what society needed, we could then calculate the quantity of goods each person must receive in order for each person to receive equally. In short, the formula for distributive egalitarianism might be labor expended divided by labor in goods produced. In short, the formula for distributive egalitarianism might be labor expended divided by labor in goods produced. This is a simple inversion of the formula of productive egalitarianism. The Communist Society for Engels did not mean that each person had returned to him an amount of labor and goods equivalent to the amount of labor time he had expended. It meant, however, that each person received an equal portion of the total labor and goods produced by society. The ideal of distributive egalitarianism was applied to the total product of society. Engels' vision of a communist society was thus an amalgam of Saint-Simonian technocracy and Babouvist economic egalitarianism. It was a mathematically rationalized society. It was Engels' belief that advances in physics and chemistry had made communist economic egalitarianism a practical possibility. By quantifying labor, it would then be possible to distribute productive labor time equally and distribute labor in goods equally. The absolute standard for Engels was not value but labor. An economic calculus could apportion the pool of labor and goods on an egalitarian basis. This would prevent an unbalanced apportionment of labor and goods to any particular person or social group. In short, equality of possessions meant equality of social power, social privilege, and social rights. Marx had offered a different description of communism. In his critique of the Gotha program, Marx referred to production and distribution under communism in the following words: "From each according to his ability to each according to his needs." The standard Marx set up for production and distribution was not the quantification of labor. The standard Marx set up related to abilities, talents, and needs. According to Marx, what one produced corresponded to his abilities. Conversely, what one consumed corresponded to his needs. The standard of judgment was the species being of man. Communist society, according to Marx, was a society in which the processes of production and distribution were carried on in accordance with the naturalistic needs and abilities of man. Marx's economics was anthropocentric, that is, the naturalistic core of man determined the procedure and balance of production and distribution. According to Engels, production and distribution under communism were carried on by means of mathematical formulae. The standard judgment was not the species being of man, but the need for algebraic balance. Engels' economics was not anthropocentric, but rather mathematical. 6. Centralized planning and worker control. Engels was a centralist. Economic planning should be carried on by one central organ. Industrial production should be carried on in large manufacturing units. Agriculture, too, should be centralized. Small farms will be eliminated under communism. Large agrarian units would amount to agricultural and industrial units would take the place of the small farm. Engels was primarily concerned about productivity. The most productive units for Engels, both in industry and agriculture, were large and centrally organized. The workers themselves could be trained to run these manufacturing and agricultural combines. Primarily, the skills needed were technical and managerial skills. The educational system under communism would train workers to function also as engineers and industrial bureaucrats. Engels believed that the workers themselves, with proper training, would be taught to administer the industrial bureaucracy. Then it would be possible to rotate and circulate a worker through many levels and functions of the agricultural and manufacturing combines. The end of centralized planning and worker control was increased output. The fundamental criteria for Engels was always quantity. In discussing the communist method of distribution, Engels wrote to Conrad Schmidt on August 5, 1890 that, quote, "After all, the method of distribution essentially depends on how much there is to distribute," end quote. The quest for, quote, "how much," end quote, determined the, quote, "how," end quote. Section 7, freedom and necessity. Engels felt that he had solved the riddle between freedom and necessity. By necessity, Engels meant natural law that was uncontrolled by human consciousness. Capitalism, for instance, was still the realm of necessity. Natural and economic law operated in capitalist society, but without human guidance. Therefore, capitalism was unorganized, uncontrolled, anachronistic, and blind necessity would lead to its destruction. Natural and economic law still operate in communist society, but in a communist society, these laws would be subject to conscious human control. Communism was therefore the realm of human freedom. It was the realm of human freedom because necessity was guided, was directed by a human plan. Man was not subject to necessity. Necessity was subject to man. Engels still defined freedom as freedom from. According to Engels, man was free when he was not controlled by external forces, when he was not mastered by external forces. To be free for Engels was to have control over. Not to be free for Engels was to be dependent upon forces outside of one. Marx had defined freedom in a totally different way. Rather, Marx had not defined freedom as either freedom from or freedom over. Rather, Marx had defined freedom as freedom to. Doesn't the kind of freedom from posit, like the negative conception of freedom, always posit a certain freedom to? Right? I think that's in Kant, right? The absence of heteronomy presupposes autonomy. Rather, Marx had defined freedom as freedom to. Freedom for Marx meant the ability of the human being to function in accordance with the laws of its nature. Marx was talking about individual and social harmony, whereas Engels was talking about Faustian control over nature. Marx was talking about happiness. Engels was talking about output. For Marx, communism would make man at home in nature. For Engels, communism would allow man to exercise control over nature. Engels' ideal of communism combined the Saint-Simonian dream of technological and managerial efficiency with the economic egalitarianism of Gracchus Babeuf. Its central image was the conception of nature and society as a gigantic industrial unit, with man standing augustly atop it, controlling its laws and thereby controlling its output. Its essential moral component was the ethic of work, Puritanism in the guise of industrial productivity. Engels was primarily concerned with man who worked, still the bourgeois pietistic dream, and he joined the man who labored to the scientific and industrial utopianism that seemed to be dawning at the end of the 19th century. Engels' conclusions at the end of his life need not surprise us. They were there at the beginning of his life. In his Outline of a Critique of Political Economy and in his Principles of Communism, Engels had already made communism synonymous with productivity, had already made communism synonymous with work and equal distribution. His basic idea of communism were continuous and persistent throughout his life. He did not change. Rather, it was the death of Marx that freed him, both in the psychological sense and in the time he could devote to his own work to express his own unique ideas, his own system of thought. It was at that time that he could give voice to his own intellectual predispositions, to his own inclinations of mind. Dialectics, as understood by Marx, meant dialectical naturalism. Conversely, it was Engels who used the phrase, quote, scientific socialism, end quote. In the hands of Engels, socialism was the methodology of industrial and scientific inevitability. Socialism became the study of economic law. Socialism therefore meant predictability. Socialism became then a mechanistic science. It had been rigidified and dogmatized. That's the end of the piece. Check out some of these footnotes here. Some of the citations. Ludwig Feuerbach, Principles of the Philosophy of the Future. Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. Says was originally published in the 4th and 5th numbers of the Neue Zeit in 1886. In 1888, these two articles were combined and published as a book. 3. These letters and Engels' comments on Feuerbach contained in them have already been discussed in Chapter 8. Engels, the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man. For a discussion of Marx's definition of communism, see Chapter 4. Marx's approach to all these ideas is described in detail in that chapter. Marx's anthropological thought has become the subject of several books. Ernest Mandel's The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx. Istvan Mesaros's Marx's Theory of Alienation. Bertil Ohlmann's Marx's Conception of Man in Capitalist Society. For a completely opposite view, one that denies the relevance of anthropological thought in Marx, see Louis Althusser for Marx. Engels, Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels letter to T. Kuno. Engels, On Authority. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program. A letter to Babel from Engels from 1875. Engels to Otto von Bühnick. Engels, The Housing Question. That's it. Thanks for listening. That's been Chapter 13 of The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels by Norman Levine. Thank you so much for listening.